Hello folks and welcome back to the channel. A few days ago I put up a poll here on YouTube asking you guys whose discography I should rank next. And you voted for Slayer, so that's what we're going to do here today. And if you're a Slayer fan or a metal fan in general, then smash that like button and subscribe with your bell notifications turned on. Because now it's time for some The worst Slayer album is in my opinion Diabolos in Musica, and for a short period of their career they started to look at what others were doing instead of themselves setting the standard, because there are some hints of groove and new metal on Diabolos in Musica. I know that some Slayer fans don't like to hear that, but it's the honest truth. And this was a step away from the classic thrash sound of the 80s, even if no Slayer album sounded the same. This was the biggest change in direction that the band ever did. And this album has a bigger emphasis on slow and grinding riffs instead of that insane over-the-top speed of some of their previous works. And Tom Araya's vocals are also very compressed on this album. They just sound awful, and I think that Diabolos in Musica is the only Slayer album without any redeeming qualities. It's just a sad excuse of an album. Next. In 11th place we have its follow-up, God Hates Us All, and the same can be said about this album to some extent. But the groove and new metal tendencies were definitely toned down since the last record. And this album was released on 9/11, yeah, in 2001 when we saw those horrible attacks on the Twin Towers. So for that reason alone, this album's release wasn't exactly the talk of the town, for understandable reasons. This was my earliest memory of a Slayer album being released when it came out in 2001, which was a big comeback year for thrash metal with new and cool albums from Creator, Destruction and Sodom to name a few. But those records had more of an old school sound to them than the new Slayer record, God Hates Us All. And songs like Disciple and Bloodline are amongst the more memorable tracks on the album. Next. In 10th place we have their last studio album Repentless from 2015, and this became the only Slayer album featuring Gary Holt, whom is of course a legendary guitarist on his own in Exodus, and Bostaph also stepped in to replace Dave Lombardo here. And this album is kind of what I expected from the band at this point. It's modern thrash with slightly decompressed vocals, and it's an album that never fully captivated me, but what I remember most about this album was all the rather violent music videos that they put out to promote this album, for songs like You Against You, Pride and Prejudice and Repentless. Repentless is by the way just a made up word, it's not even in the dictionary. Next. In 9th place we have the last Slayer album featuring Jeff Hanneman, rest in peace, and Dave Lombardo, whom left the band after this record. And I'm of course talking about 2009's World Painted Blood. And this was probably the Slayer album that I've listened to the least after Diabolos in Musica. And during the time of its release, I was tired of the band after a couple of rather uninteresting albums, and this album didn't do much to convince me to get back into the band. Next. In 8th place I put Undisputed Attitude, and this is not a studio album, but they recorded some new songs for this album, so I thought why not include it in this video, even if the original songs that they wrote for this album were crap. On Undisputed Attitude, Slayer pays tribute to a lot of hardcore and punk bands, everything from Verbal Abuse to Minor Threat, DRI and the Stooges. So, next. In 7th place we have Christ Illusion, and this is my favorite Slayer record of the more modern era post Divine Intervention. And on Christ Illusion, it felt like the band tried to go back and take inspiration from their albums of the 80s. It was also the first time since Seasons in the Abyss that the original lineup of Araya, Hanneman, King and Lombardo recorded an album together. So they brought back the classic red Slayer logo, and Larry Carroll, whom painted their classic artworks of the 80s, was back and he painted this cover as well. So everything was in place for this to be the band's full comeback to form. And to some degree it was, but it never really reached the heights of their classic era, even if I think that this is the best modern day Slayer record. And songs like Flesh Storm, Catalyst, Supremist and Jihad was cool. Next. In 666th place we have Divine Intervention from 94. And it was on this record that we started to see some changes on the horizon. The 80s and the early 90s had been a very successful time for the band. And during this time period, thrash metal was losing its popularity. But Slayer wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. When the other bands in the Big Four decided to put out some radio-friendly material, Slayer decided to believe in what they were doing and put out another thrash record, even if the genre was more or less dead and gone by 94. Divine Intervention wasn't as good as those records that came before it, but I think we need to respect Slayer for going against the mainstream and putting out a thrash record, even if it wasn't as good as those previous albums. Next. In 5th place we have South of Heaven from 1988, and this was the follow-up to Rain in Blood. So it was destined to fail, no matter how good of a record South of Heaven was going to be. I think they took a little different approach on this album though. It's not as fast or aggressive as Rain in Blood. Instead it's kinda laid back, especially Tom Araya's vocals. I wish he would have been a little more aggressive on this album, then I could have ranked it a little higher. But there is a lot of great songs on this album: Silent Scream, Behind the Crooked Cross, Mandatory Suicide, and the Judas Priest cover, Dissident Aggressor. And South of Heaven might have been a minor disappointment at the time, but let's face it, this is an excellent thrash record. Next. In 4th place we have Seasons in the Abyss, and this might be their most accessible album. It's well produced, and it's not always 100 miles per hour straight ahead thrash. They dare to experiment a bit more on this record. And songs like War Ensemble, Expendable Youth and Seasons in the Abyss are certified Slayer classics. The vocals from Tom Araya sounds a bit more controlled on this album than on their previous records. Still, Seasons in the Abyss was one of the best thrash albums of the 90s, that's for sure. Next. In 3rd place we have the shocker on this list, which is Rain in Blood. Hailed as the greatest thrash metal album of all time, but I must disagree, since I put it as my number 3. And it's a fast and blistering album. The album ain't even 30 minutes long, but it's such a ferocious album. Angel of Death is like the perfect opener, and Rain in Blood is the perfect ending of a record. But in between those songs there are some tracks that are good, but they don't stand out to me as remarkable. Sure, Piece by Piece and Post Mortem are great thrashers, but some of the other 2-minute songs on Rain in Blood aren't as interesting as some of their compositions from their previous 2 albums. Still, this is a super intense album, and one of the true masterpieces of the genre. Next. In 2nd place we have Hell Awaits from 1985, and I love this record. I wish they would have sounded like this forever, because this is such a menacing record. And for me, Slayer was at their best while being signed to Metal Blade Records. Maybe it was the youthful energy at the time, but Hell Awaits is a remarkable album. And the title track is very cool. It's the intro of the album, and they build up some tension with those rhythmic riffs that later turns into complete mayhem. It's just awesome. And several of the greatest Slayer tracks are on this album, like Kill Again, At Dawn They Sleep and Necrophiliac. And this album is more of that caveman style thrash than their following 3 records that have a cleaner production, which had a lot to do with the band switching labels after this album. Next. The number 1 Slayer record is of course the utterly brilliant 1983 debut album Show No Mercy. And this should be their crowning achievement in my opinion, because this is the masterpiece that everyone says that Rain in Blood is. Before this album there was like Anvil, Venom and Metallica, and Show No Mercy was definitely a game changer when it came out. It was like everything vile and violent packaged into one album. But it's not just groundbreaking, it's also their best album. I mean, songs like Evil Has No Boundaries, The Antichrist, Die by the Sword, Black Magic and Cryonics are all masterpieces. Tom Araya sings better on this album than on any other Slayer release. And some people say that this album had some new wave British heavy metal sounding riffs to it. And sure, there is a tiny bit of Iron Maiden and Venom on this album, but I don't mind that. I think that had to do more with the era when this album was released. If they would have recorded the same songs and released it in 1990, I bet it would have sounded very different, if you get what I'm saying here. So for me, this was a given winner, because Show No Mercy is close to a perfect metal album. So, do you guys agree with me? Let me know by dropping your favorite Slayer albums down in the comment section below. Or do you think that Rain in Blood is the obvious choice here? Or perhaps Hell Awaits or Seasons in the Abyss? Feel free to share your favorites, and if you enjoyed this episode of Rank 'Em All, where we ranked Slayer's full discography, then smash that like button and subscribe with your bell notifications turned on. And if you want to become an absolute sir and a supporter of my channel, then I'll suggest that you check out my Patreon page and donate a few bucks. Or go and grab yourself a cool looking shirt at the Ruthless metal store. And join the legions over on Discord, Facebook, or check out my thrash metal playlist on Spotify. It's all linked down below. And let me know whose discography I should rank in the next episode of Rank 'Em All. And that's it folks, stay heavy, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye bye.